letter that turned Ivy Sutcliffe out of the only house she had ever lived in was 3 lines long, and her uncle read it to her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday in November with his boots on the fender, and when he had finished, he folded it very small, as though it were valuable, and put it back in his waistcoat, and said that the school board had let the cottage to the new master, and that she had until the end of the month. She was 23 that autumn, brown-haired, gray-eyed, thin from a hard year, and she had kept her father's school cottage swept and warm for the 11 months since he had died, on the understanding, never written, and now plainly never meant, that a place would be found for her. Her father, Josiah Sutcliffe, had been schoolmaster of the parish of Aldworth for 19 years, and he had taught 2 generations of plowboys their letters and their sums, and he had taught his own daughter a great deal more than that, because he had had nobody else to teach it to, and because she had wanted it. He had taught her Latin and a little Greek. He had taught her to keep a ledger so that every column stood to the farthing. And he had taught her, on long winter evenings with a candle and a box of old parish documents borrowed from the vestry, to read a hand, any hand, a secretary hand of 200 years before, or a clerk's copperplate, or a dying man's shake, and to tell one from another the way a shepherd tells one sheep in 100, by the turn of a letter and the lift of a pen and the small, unrepeatable habits that a hand cannot help. It was a strange thing to give a girl. It was of no earthly use to anybody, her aunt said, and would never boil a pot. Ivy had thought so too, in a mild way, for most of her life. She had no notion yet that it was the most valuable thing she owned. Her uncle was a corn factor named Barrow, her mother's brother, a heavy, careful man who had done well and who resented, in the exact proportion of his success, any claim upon it. He had buried his sister's husband cheaply, and he had let his sister's daughter keep house for herself out of a horror of gossip rather than any tenderness. And now that 11 months had passed and the talk had died, he wanted the thing settled. There were 2 ways it could go, he told her, over the folded letter, in the tone of a man laying out a fair choice. She could go into service. He would speak to a house in York, a merchant's house, where they wanted a girl who could sew and cipher, and she would have her keep and a wage and would trouble nobody. Or, if she thought herself too good for a place, which he did not for a moment suggest, but which he had heard suggested, she could see how she liked the alternative, which he did not name, because he did not need to. Everyone in that country knew the alternative to service for a woman with no money and no husband and no roof. It stood on the hill above Aldworth with its high windows and its wall, and it took in the old and the mad and the ruined, and the parish paid for their gruel, and they did not come out. Ivy said she would think about York. She did not think about York. She sat that night by a fire she was no longer entitled to and did the only arithmetic that mattered, which was that she had 4 pounds and some shillings in a tin, a box of her father's books she could not sell for what they were worth, and 11 days. It was in the 11 days that the stranger came. He came to the door on the Thursday, in the wet, a tall man in a plain dark coat cut for use and not for show, with black hair going gray a little at the temple, though he was not old, and gray eyes set deep, and a way of standing very still that she took at first for coldness and understood later was only a man holding himself in. He asked for the schoolmaster's daughter by name. He said his name was Vane, Gideon Vane, and that he dealt in horses in the north, and that he had heard in the village, where a man hears everything if he stands still in the right yard, that Miss Sutcliffe was to be turned out at the month's end and had no people to go to. Ivy stood in the doorway with her hand on the latch and told him, with more spirit than she felt, that her circumstances were her own, and that she did not see how a horse dealer came to be discussing them on her step, in the rain. He said no, and that she was right. and that he would be plain, because he had not the gift of being anything else, and had given up trying. He said he was a widower. That was a lie, but it was the only one he told her, and he paid for it afterwards in a coin he had not known he possessed. He said he had a house in the north, a plain house, a good acreage, horses, and no wife to run it and no wish to court one in the ordinary way, having no talent for it and no time. He said he wanted a woman who could keep a house honestly and hold a still tongue and stand on her own feet, and that he had asked in 3 villages and had been told in this one that there was such a woman, a schoolmaster's daughter, clever with figures, respectable, and about to be sent to the workhouse or into service for the want of 40 pounds a year. He said he could offer marriage, not love, he was too honest for that, and she was grateful for it later in a way she could not have foreseen. A name, a roof, work worth doing, and never in her life again the inside of a poorhouse or the back stairs of a merchant in York. He said she might take a day to think, or a week, but that he could not stay above the Saturday because he had beasts to move. Ivy shut the door on him and stood with her back against it, and her heart was going in a way she despised herself for. She was not a romantic girl. Her father had cured her of that early, mostly by dying poor. But she knew the shape of the 2 roads in front of her, the merchant's back stairs and the house on the hill, and here was a 3rd road that had walked up out of the rain, plain and unlovely and offering her the one thing neither of the others would, which was a threshold of her own to stand in. She made inquiries, because she was her father's daughter and not a fool. She walked to the inn where he was lodged and asked the ostler about the man Vane, and the ostler said he was a quiet gentleman who paid well and knew more about a horse's leg than any farrier in the riding, and that he had come down from the north with a good pair and a plain gig and had given no trouble. She wrote to a woman she knew in service near Ripon and had no time to get an answer. In the end, she decided the way people decide such things, not by weighing, but by waking one morning already decided. She sent word to the inn on the Friday that she would marry him, and she was married to him on the following Wednesday, by license, in Aldworth Church, by the curate who had christened her, with the sexton and the sexton's wife for witnesses, and her Uncle Barrow standing at the back with an expression of profound and calculating relief. Her aunt did not come. She wore her mother's ring, made smaller with a twist of thread, and a gray wool dress she had turned and pressed until it looked nearly new. And she carried nothing, because there was nothing to carry that was hers. Gideon Vane put a plain gold band on her finger and said the words in a low, even voice, and looked at her once, steadily, at the moment the curate joined them, in a way that she turned over for a long time afterward, because it was not the look of a man taking a housekeeper. It was the look of a man taking a risk he had decided to take and was frightened of. They ate a cold dinner at the inn. He was courteous and said little. He told her they would travel north in the morning, 2 days on the road, and that she should sleep. And he took a separate room and paid for it, and she noticed that too. In the morning there was not a plain gig at the inn door, but a traveling chaise, dark green, well sprung, with a pair of matched bays and a driver in a plain drab coat, and when she looked at it and then at him, he said only that a man in the horse line could always borrow a good carriage and that she would be more comfortable, and handed her up. And they went north out of the only country she had ever known, with the November hedges black and dripping and Aldworth Church tower dropping behind them into the mist. She watched it go with less grief than she had expected, and understood that a place stops being home the day it decides it does not want you, and that the deciding is all on the one side. They traveled 2 days. He was, she found, easy to be silent with. which is a rarer thing than being easy to talk to. On the first day he asked her about her father, and she told him, and he listened in a way that she was not used to being listened to, without the small movements of a man waiting for his turn. And when she mentioned, in passing, the box of parish documents and the reading of old hands, she saw him go still in a new way, and file it, though she did not know then that he was filing it. On the second day, the country changed. The hedges gave way to walls, the walls to open brown moor, and the moor to a long river valley with hanging woods on the far side going up to a gray line of hills. And the light came down through the November cloud in bars the color of weak tea. And it was beautiful in a hard way, and she said so. And he said, yes. And something in the single word made her look at him, because it was the voice of a man looking at a thing he loved and dreaded in the same breath. In the middle of the afternoon of the second day, they came to a village of gray stone. One street, an inn, a green, a church, and beyond it a long high wall of dressed stone that ran along the road for what she took at first to be the boundary of a park, and then realized, as it went on, was too long and too fine for any farm she had ever heard of. She looked at it and said nothing, and then the wall broke. At a pair of iron gates a wagon could have driven through 4 abreast, with stone piers, and on each pier a carved beast worn by weather to a stump, and a lodge beside them. And a woman came out of the lodge and saw the green chaise, and dropped a curtsy so deep and so quick that Ivy felt it in her own knees. And the gates were open, and the driver turned the bays in through them and up a drive that did not go to any plain house in the world. It ran straight for the better part of a mile between 2 ranks of great bare limes, and at the end of it, when the trees at last let go of the view, there was a house the color of honey in the low sun. 3 stories and 100 windows, and a front like the front of a cathedral, with a flight of steps up to a door under a stone porch a coach could have stood in, and smoke going up straight from a dozen chimneys into the still cold air. And Ivy Sutcliffe, who had 4 pounds in a tin and had been married 6 days to a horse dealer to keep out of the poorhouse, sat very upright on the seat of the green chaise, and looked at it coming toward her, and heard her own voice when it came from a long way off. She said, "Whose house is that?" And the man beside her, who had not spoken for a mile, looked straight ahead at the honey-colored front and the 100 windows and said, in a voice she had not heard him use before, low and even and braced, "Mine?" She turned and looked at him. He did not turn. He said, "I am the Duke of Harrowfield, and this is Harrowfield Hall, and I have deceived you, and I will explain every word of it inside. And if when you have heard it you wish to be taken back to Aldworth tomorrow, I will take you myself and settle enough upon you that you need never see a workhouse or a back stair as long as you live. But I ask you to hear it first." And the chaise came up the last of the drive and stood before the great steps, and the door at the top of them opened, and men in dark livery came down, and Ivy sat with her cold hands folded in her lap, and her father's daughter's steadiness, holding her together by a thread, and understood that she had married a stranger, twice over, and that the second stranger was a great deal further above her than the first had been below. He took her not into the great hall with its cold marble and its stags' heads, but into a small room off it, a book room with a fire lit and 2 chairs, and he shut the door on the servants who were carrying in her one poor box. And he stood with his back to the fire and told her the truth standing up, the way a man takes a dose he has been putting off. He said that his name was Gideon Amberley, and that he had been Duke of Harrowfield for 2 years, since his father died, and the Duke before that for 31 years he had been the heir, growing up in this house learning to be the thing it needed. He said that 3 years before, in the spring of 1868. He had been engaged to be married to a young woman of a great family in the next county, a match arranged when they were both children and grown into with what he had believed on his side to be affection, and on hers he had believed the same. Her name he would give her because she would hear it soon enough and had better hear it first from him. She was Miss Lucinda Cardew, daughter of Sir Roland Cardew of Cardew Court, and she was beautiful and clever and everything the county admired, and he had been, he said, in the plain way he said everything, a fool for her. In the manner of a serious man who loves once and badly, he said that the wedding had been set, the church bespoke, the whole county invited, the breakfast ordered, and that on the morning of it he had stood at the altar of Harrowfield Church before 400 people for 50 minutes, and that she had not come. She had gone in the night, he said, north over the border with the Marquess of Ennerdale, who had 60,000 a year to his own 30 and a house twice the size of this one, and she had left him a letter, which he had read on the altar step with 400 people watching him read it, and which had said, in effect, that she had thought better of it, and that he would understand. He said, I did not understand. He said it flatly, looking at the fire, 3 years on, and Ivy understood that he did not understand it yet. He said that a man may be pitied for such a thing for a month, and then the pity turns, because the county cannot forgive a man for having been made ridiculous in front of it, that pity is a debt and people hate their creditors, and that within the year he had become, in the drawing rooms of that country, not the man who had been cruelly used, but the man there must be something wrong with. The cold Duke, the proud Duke, the Duke no woman would have, and that his father, who had loved him and had built the match and had been humiliated in his own church, had taken it hard, had aged in a season, and had died in the winter of 1869 with, Gideon said, and here his even voice went down to almost nothing. A great deal on his mind that I did not understand until later, and wish to God I had understood in time to ease him. He said that he had resolved 2 things over his father's grave. The first was that he would never again offer himself to be chosen for what he was, a title and a house and 30,000 a year, and be found wanting against a bigger one. And the second was that the house needed a mistress, and the name needed an heir, and he was not a boy to indulge a broken heart forever. And so he had done, he said, the thing she now knew he had done, which any sensible person would call mad, and which had seemed to him in his pride the only clean way left. He had gone out of his own county as a plain man, Mr. Vane, a horse dealer, which was near enough true because he bred the best horses in the north and knew the trade to the ground, and he had looked quietly in 3 counties for a woman who was poor enough to need what he could plainly offer, honest enough to keep a house and a promise, and strong enough to stand up in a hard place. And he had found in a schoolmaster's cottage in Aldworth a woman who was all 3, and he had married her before she could learn his name and refuse it for the wrong reasons or accept it for worse ones. He said, I wanted to be married for the roof and the work and the plain bargain by a woman who could not possibly want the rest of it because she did not know it was there. He said, it was not fair to you. I knew it was not fair when I did it, and I did it because I could not think how else to be sure. And now you are here, and it is done, and you are the Duchess of Harrowfield, whether either of us likes the size of that or not. And I have told you the whole of it. And there is a bell by your hand that will bring a woman to take you to a warm room and a supper. And there is a chaise in the stable that will take you to Aldworth in the morning, and both of those things are yours to choose, and I will not say one word to wait the choice, except that I am sorry and that I have not been sorry out loud to anyone in 3 years, and find it is harder than I expected. Ivy sat in the chair by the fire in her turned gray dress with her hands in her lap, and heard all of it without moving, because her father had taught her that the first thing to do with a great deal of information is to let it finish arriving before you begin to sort it. When he had done, she was quiet for long enough that the fire spat twice. Then she said, "You told me one lie. You said you were a widower." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" And Gideon Amberley, Duke of Harrowfield, looked at the schoolmaster's daughter he had married under a false name and said, "Because a widower is a man who has loved a woman and lost her. And I wanted you to think you were marrying a man who had loved and could again, and not a man who had been laughed at in a church. It was vanity. It was the last of it, I think. You may add it to the account." And Ivy, who had come into that room frightened and humiliated and ready to be angry because anger is warmer than fear, found the anger going out of her like a tide, because she had just been handed, by a duke in a book room, the one thing her whole life had taught her to value above rubies, which was a person telling her the exact truth about himself when a lie would have served him better. She did not decide to stay in that moment. She was too careful for that, and too tired. But she decided not to ring the bell for the chaise, and she said, "I will stay tonight and see the house, and we will speak in the morning." And she saw him take a breath that he had plainly been holding since the iron gates, and he said, "Thank you," and rang the bell himself, and a woman came. The woman was the housekeeper, Mrs. Bledlow, 60 years old, straight as a yard of pump water, with a face that had learned long ago to show a governess or a duchess exactly the same courteous nothing. And she took the new duchess up a staircase Ivy could have laid her whole cottage across the foot of, and along a gallery hung with 200 years of Amberleys looking down, and put her into a room with a fire and a bed with 4 posts and a supper on a tray under a cover, and said, in a voice with nothing in it at all, that if her grace wanted anything in the night she had only to ring. And her grace, Ivy thought, standing in the middle of the enormous warm room after the door had shut, is me. She did not sleep much. She sat up in the great bed and ate the supper, which was very good, and looked at the fire, and thought about the 2 roads in Aldworth, and the 3rd road that had walked out of the rain, and had turned out to have a 4th road folded up inside it that she could never have imagined. And she thought about the man downstairs who had told her the truth, and about the woman who had left him at the altar and married a marquis, and she found, examining herself honestly in the way her father had trained her to, that she did not pity the Duke of Harrowfield exactly, because pity was the thing that had ruined him, and she would not add to the pile. What she felt was closer to recognition. She had been turned out, too. She had been decided against by people who owed her better. She knew, better than any grand lady in the county could, exactly what it was to be made small by the people whose good opinion you had been raised to need, and to have to build yourself back up out of nothing but your own spine. In the morning she did not ask for the chaise. She came down the great staircase in her gray dress with her hair done plain, and found the Duke in the breakfast room standing at the window. And she said, "Good morning," and asked him in a level voice to show her the house, because a woman could not run what she had not seen, and she watched the thing that happened in his face when he understood that she was staying. And she thought, that is a man who has not been chosen in a long time, and it is a strange thing to be the one to do it. She did not tell him that the choosing was not done. She was a schoolmaster's daughter, and she made no promises she had not tested. But she took the house. She met the household that first week the way she had taken the still, cold cottage after her father died, by walking into every room of it and putting her hand on things. There were 41 indoor servants at Harrowfield Hall, and she learned the name of every one of them inside a fortnight, which no duchess in the county had troubled to do in living memory, and it went round the servants' hall like a warm draught. There was Mrs. Bledlow, who thawed by a degree a week. There was the butler, Mr. Ashe, grave and kind. There was a steward for the estate, Mr. Pruitt, whom she did not take to and could not at first have said why, a smooth youngish man with very clean hands who had come to the place only 2 years before, in the bad winter after the old Duke died, and who spoke of the estate's affairs in a soothing way that reminded her, though she did not place it yet, of her Uncle Barrow folding a letter very small. And there was, at the top of the house, in a suite of rooms hung with faded blue, the person who was to be the hardest ground of all, and the most worth the taking, and whom Ivy did not meet until the 5th day, because the person had let it be known that she was not well enough to receive the new duchess, and would send word when she was, which was a slap delivered in the politest possible glove, and which Ivy, reading it exactly, chose to answer not with offense but with patience, because she had learned from her father, patient over a box of crumbling parish documents, that the thing which will not be hurried must be outwaited, and that there is no wall so high as an old woman who has decided against you, and no gate that opens sweeter when at last it opens. The person in the blue rooms was the Dowager Duchess of Harrowfield Augusta, Gideon's grandmother, 79 years old, who had come to that house as a bride in the year 1812, and had buried in it a husband, 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, and every soft thing she had ever owned, except her back, which was still perfectly straight. She had ruled the county from the blue rooms for 40 years, and she had watched her grandson stand at the altar for 50 minutes in front of 400 people, and she had never, she told her maid, forgiven the world for it, and did not intend to begin now with a schoolmaster's daughter, that the boy had gone and married in a fit of pride under a false name in a village nobody had heard of, to spite a woman who was not worth the spite. When she at last sent word that she would receive the Duchess, on the 5th afternoon, it was a summons and not an invitation, and Ivy climbed the stairs to it knowing exactly what it was, and went in with her hands quiet and her chin level. The old woman was sitting bolt upright by her own fire in black silk with a cap of old lace, and she had milky rings coming in the gray of both eyes, and did not see as well as she once had, and would have died before she admitted it, and she looked the new Duchess up and down with what sight she had, and said, without any greeting at all, "So you are the person who has made my grandson a laughing stock for the 2nd time in 3 years." Ivy stood in the middle of the blue carpet and did not flinch, and said, "Good afternoon, ma'am. I am the person your grandson married. Whether I am to be a laughing-stock is not yet decided, and I had rather hoped you might help me see it decided the other way, since we appear to want the same thing, which is that no one should laugh at this house again." There was a silence in the blue room of a kind the blue room had not heard in years. The dowager's maid, in the corner, stopped breathing. The old woman turned her head a little, the way the half-blind do to bring a thing into the corner of the eye where the sight is better, and looked at Ivy properly for the first time, and said, in a different voice, not warmer, but more careful, "And who taught you to speak to a duchess like that?" And Ivy said, "My father, ma'am, who was a schoolmaster, and who taught me that rank is owed courtesy, and truth is owed courage, and that a person who cannot tell which is which will spend her life giving the wrong one to the wrong one." The dowager looked at her a while longer. Then she said, "Sit down, girl. You are giving me a crick." And Ivy sat, and that was the beginning of it, though it was a beginning that would take 2 months to look like one. She won the old woman the way you win anything worth winning, slowly and at a cost, and she won her, in the end, through the library. Harrowfield had a library of 11,000 books in a long room on the south front, and it had a muniment room off it, where the papers of the estate were kept. 300 years of them, deeds and rolls and letter books and marriage settlements, and Ivy found it in her second week and stood in the doorway of it with the particular hunger of a person who has been raised among a few precious documents and has just walked into a room with 100,000. And Mr. Ashy the butler, watching her face, unbent enough to tell her that the old Duke, the present Duke's father, had spent his last years cataloging it and had not finished, and that it had sat untouched since he died. Ivy asked the dowager's leave to take up the cataloging, framing it as a wish to be useful and not idle. And the dowager, who had loved her son and had not been able to bear the sight of his unfinished work, said sharply that she might do as she liked. The room was nothing but dust. And then, 3 days later, had herself carried down in a chair to see what the girl was doing, and found the schoolmaster's daughter sitting at the old Duke's own table with his own catalogue open beside her, continuing his hand and his system exactly, in a clear even copper plate, entry after entry. And the old woman sat in her chair in the doorway and looked at her dead son's work going forward again under a stranger's pen, and did not say anything for a long time. And when she went up again, she told her maid that the girl was not a fool. And that was, from the Dowager Duchess of Harrowfield, a coronation. Gideon watched all this the way a man watches weather he does not dare to hope for. He had married her as a bargain, and he had told her so, and he held himself to it with a rigid honesty that Ivy came to see was the frame he had built to keep himself upright, and he did not presume, and he did not intrude, and he was courteous at the dinner table and grave in the passages. And every day, without either of them naming it, they spent an hour or two in the library where he would come in on the pretext of a book and stay on the pretext of another, and they would talk, plainly, as two clever, lonely people talk when they have stopped performing, about the estate and the county and the books, and, once, carefully, about the woman who had gone north with a Marcus. And Ivy learned to read him the way she read a hand. By the small, unrepeatable habits a man cannot help, the way his shoulders came down a half-inch when she laughed, the way he went still and careful whenever the estate's money was mentioned, which was oftener than an estate of 30,000 a year should have made a man go still. She noticed that. She was noticing a good many things by then. She noticed that the steward, Mr. Pruitt, brought his account books to the Duke on the 1st of every month and took them away again the same day, which was not how her father or any honest clerk she had ever known kept accounts, because honest books stay open on the table where anyone may look. It is only frightened books that travel. She noticed that Gideon signed what Pruitt put before him with the weary trust of a man who has been told the affairs are complicated and has decided to believe it, and that the affairs had become complicated, by Pruitt's account, only in the 2 years since the old Duke died, which was also the 2 years since Pruitt came. And she noticed, most of all, on a gray afternoon in her 5th week, going through a letter box in the muniment room that had not been opened since before the old Duke's death, that the estate which the county believed to be one of the richest in the north, and which fed 41 indoor servants and kept a mile of limes and 100 windows warm, was being spoken of, in Pruitt's smooth monthly voice, as a house in difficulties, and that the word difficulties, in the mouth of a man with very clean hands, had begun to sound to Ivy Sutcliffe exactly like her Uncle Barrow, folding a 3-line letter very small and putting it back in his waistcoat as though it were valuable. It came to a head in the 7th week, in December, with a caller. Ivy was in the library when Mr. Ashe came to say, with a stiffness in his face she had not seen before, that Sir Rowland Cardo and Miss Cardo had driven over from Cardew Court and were with his Grace in the great drawing-room, and had asked that the Duchess be sent for. Ivy stood up slowly. She had heard the names for 7 weeks, and had built the people out of Gideon's flat, careful sentences, and out of the Dowager's one venomous line, and now they were in the house. The man whose daughter had left her grandson at the altar, and the daughter herself, back from the north, and asking for the Duchess to be sent for, which was a thing done for one reason only, to look at her. Ivy went down. She did not change her dress. She came into the great drawing-room in her gray wool, with her hair done plain, and found 4 people arranged in it like a picture of a thing about to go wrong. Gideon standing by the fire with his face gone to the flat plain stillness she had learned, meant he was holding himself in with both hands. A heavy, florid man of 60, in a blue coat. Sir Rowland Cardew, standing too near the hearth and too much at home, and on the sofa a woman of perhaps 8 and 20, in a traveling dress the color of a dove's breast that had cost more than Harrowfield paid a housemaid in 10 years. Fair, lovely, with a face made for exactly this, a face that arranged itself, as Ivy came in, into an expression of the sweetest and most wounding interest. This was Lucinda. She was not a marchioness after all, that Ivy would learn within the hour, was the whole engine of what followed. The Marquis of Ennerdale had married her in the spring of 1868 and had died in the autumn of 1870, leaving her a widow of 6 months' standing, with a jointure smaller than she had counted on, and a great deal of expensive habit. And she had come home to Cardew Court in her weeds, and she had looked about her at the county she had left, and she had seen the Duke of Harrowfield still unmarried, still rich, still there, and she had thought, Ivy understood, watching her face, that she had only to come back and be beautiful and be sorry, and the thing would close over as though it had never opened. And she had arrived to find a schoolmaster's daughter in a turned gray dress, standing in the great drawing-room of Harrowfield, with the household's respect already gathering around her like warmth around a fire. And it had, Ivy saw, in the half-second before the sweet, interested mask came down, made Lucinda Cardew very angry indeed. Sir Rowland did the talking. He was jovial and large, and he congratulated the Duke on his marriage in a voice with a hook in every sentence, and he said how charming, how very charming, that his Grace had found a bride of such, he was sure, sterling qualities, in such an, he would say, unexpected quarter, and he hoped the county would be given the pleasure of meeting the new Duchess properly. At the assembly, perhaps, the great winter assembly at the county rooms in the new year, which all the world attended, and to which, he was certain, the Duke and his Duchess would wish to come, to put, as he phrased it with a wide, wet smile, all the old talk to rest. And Ivy, standing very still, watched Gideon's face at the word assembly, and saw something there that was not the stillness of a man holding himself in, but the stillness of a man who has seen a trap and does not yet know how to say so in front of his wife, and she understood, in that moment, with the cold clarity her father had bred in her, that Sir Rowland Cardew had not driven 11 miles in December to congratulate anybody, and that the assembly in the new year was not an invitation, and that this smiling, heavy man with the wet mouth wanted something out of Harrowfield Hall a great deal larger than the pleasure of watching a duchess be laughed at, and that she had perhaps 5 weeks to find out what it was. She found out 4 days later, and she found it out because Gideon at last told her, and he told her because she gave him no choice. And she gave him no choice, because she had watched him not sleep for 4 nights, and had decided that a bargain which forbade her to help a man carry a thing that was killing him was a bargain not worth keeping. She came into the book room off the great hall on the 4th evening after the Cardew's visit, where he had taken to sitting late with a single candle and a decanter he did not much touch. And she shut the door and sat down opposite him and said, "Tell me what Sir Roland Cardew is holding over this house, because I have kept accounts since I was 12 years old, and I have watched your steward carry his books in and out of this room like a man carrying something that will not bear the light, and I am your wife, whatever the terms. And I will not sit in the library cataloging dead men's letters while you drink yourself gray over a thing I might be able to read." And Gideon Amberley looked at her across the candle for a long moment, and then he got up and went to the muniment room himself and came back with a japanned box and put it on the table between them and opened it and took out 3 papers and laid them in front of her and said, "Then read these. And God help us both, because I have shown them to 2 lawyers and they have told me the same thing, which is that they will ruin me." The 3 papers were promissory bonds. Ivy bent over them in the candlelight and read them the way her father had taught her, slowly from the paper up, before ever she let herself read the words. Each was a bond under hand and seal in the sum of £6,000, £18,000 in all, made payable by Edmund Amberley, 5th Duke of Harrowfield, to Sir Roland Cardew, Baronet, and each was dated in the year 1864, and each was signed at the foot, in a firm sloping hand, Edmund Amberley Harrowfield, and sealed with the Harrowfield seal, and each bore an endorsement that the money was lent for the improvement of the estate and was repayable, with interest at 5 in the 100, on demand after 7 years, which is to say now, in the winter of 1871, with 7 years compound interest heaped on the 18,000 until the whole came to better than £25,000, which was, Gideon said, in the flat voice of a man reciting his own execution, more than this estate can raise without selling half of it, which is precisely what Cardew intends, because half of Harrowfield marches with Cardew Court, and he has wanted it for 30 years, and now, at the Assembly, in front of the whole county, he means to present these bonds and demand his money, and I shall either pay him with my land or be shown to the county as a duke who cannot honor his own father's debts, and either way I am finished, and either way he thinks. His daughter picks over what is left. Ivy did not answer at once. She was reading the signatures. She said, "At last, without looking up, did your father borrow this money?" And Gideon said, "That is the whole horror of it, I do not know." He said, "My father kept his own affairs close in his last 2 years, and he was troubled, and he aged, and there were things on his mind he did not share with me, and he died with a great deal unsaid, and I have gone through every ledger in that muniment room and found no entry of £18,000 coming in, nor of any works it might have paid for. But a man in trouble does not always enter what shames him. And the bonds are in his hand, Ivy." That is what the 2 lawyers said. They held them to the light, and they compared them to a dozen of his letters, and they said, "The hand is his, past any doubt, and the seal is his, and there is no flaw in the instruments. And a bond in a dead man's own hand and seal is a debt, and a debt must be paid." Ivy said, "May I have a candle nearer?" And she took the 3 bonds to the branch of candles on the side table and held the first one up so that the flame was behind it, and she looked at the paper, not the writing, the paper, the way it took the light, the faint ladder of lines running through it that the eye does not see until the flame is behind them, and she went very still, in a way that Gideon, watching her, would remember for the rest of his life. because it was the first time he had seen on another person's face the exact expression he imagined must have been on his own the day he understood Lucinda was not coming. The look of the floor of the world, quietly moving. Then she put the bond down and picked up the second and did the same, and then the third. And then she stood with all three held to the light one after another, and she said, in a voice that had gone quiet and precise, "Gideon, come here and tell me what you see when I hold this to the candle." And he came and stood at her shoulder and looked, and she said, "There, in the corner, in the paper itself, the mark." And he looked, and there, held against the flame, ghosting up out of the laid lines of the paper, was a watermark, the maker's mark that every good paper mill presses into its sheets with a wire device in the mold, and it was a shield with a horn in it, the mark of a mill Ivy did not know. And beneath the shield, in figures made of the same fine wire, woven into the very substance of the paper, worked a date, and the date in the paper was 1867. Ivy said, "This bond is dated the 4th of March, 1864, and it is written on a sheet of paper that was not made until 1867, because the paper makers date their molds. Every honest mill in England does it. They change the wire date each year, and they are proud of it, and my father had a ream of Whatman in his desk with the year in the corner, and he showed it to me when I was a child, and told me it was how you could catch a liar whoback. Dated a letter. Because a man may forge a hand and forge a seal, but he cannot write in 1864 on a sheet that will not exist for 3 years." She turned and looked at him. She said, "Your father did not sign these bonds in 1864. Nobody signed these bonds in 1864. These bonds were written after 1867 on paper that gives them the lie in their own corner by somebody who could copy your father's hand and had the use of his seal, and I will tell you when I think it was written. It was written after your father died, when there was no living man to say I never borrowed a farthing from Roland Cardew in my life." Gideon Amberley stood in the book room of Harrowfield Hall with the candle flame shaking a little because his hand had begun to shake, and he said, "The lawyers held them to the light." And Ivy said, "The lawyers looked at the writing. They are trained to look at the writing. Nobody had taught them to look at the paper." "My father taught me to look at the paper, ma'am," she said, and then caught herself and laughed. A short, unsteady laugh, because she had called her own husband ma'am out of the old habit of the vestry, and the laugh cracked something in the room, and Gideon put out the shaking hand and gripped her shoulder, not gently, the grip of a drowning man who has felt the bottom under his foot, and said her name, only her name, Ivy, and she covered his hand with hers and held it there, and for a moment the bargain and the terms and the false name and the whole careful frame of it fell down. And they stood in the candlelight holding on to one another over 3 sheets of forged paper, a duke and a schoolmaster's daughter. And it was the schoolmaster's daughter who had the ground under her feet, but she was her father's daughter to the bone, and when the moment had passed she stepped back and said, "No, listen to me. This is not enough." She held up the bond. She said, "This catches them, but it does not convict them, because Cardew will stand up in front of the county and say the date in the paper is a mill's error, or that his clerk copied an old bond onto new paper for safekeeping. And there are people who will want to believe him because they have wanted for 3 years to believe the worst of this house. And a watermark is a clever thing, but it is a cold thing. And a cold, clever thing shown by a schoolmaster's daughter that half the county has already decided is a scheming nobody will not by itself break Roland Cardew. It will only warn him. and a warned liar destroys his evidence and swears the rest, and you are worse off than before." She put the bond down. She said, "We have 5 weeks until the assembly. In 5 weeks I mean to have 3 things, not 1. I mean to have the paper, which I now have. I mean to have the hand. I mean to prove that the writing itself, close read, is a copy and not your father's own, because a forger who traces or imitates a hand always leaves the same tracks, and I have read enough hands to find them. But I will need a great many of your father's true letters to do it, and the muniment room is full of them. And I mean to have a mouth, a living person who will stand up in that room and say something the county cannot argue with, and I do not yet know who that is. But I know that a fraud this size is never worked by one clean pair of hands alone, and somewhere between Cardew Court and this house there is a person who was paid to help and paid too little or frightened too much, and I mean to find that person before the new year." She looked at him. She said, "Can you get me into your steward's account room?" And Gideon said, "Why Pruitt?" And Ivy said, "Because your troubles began the month he came, and because an outside forger cannot use a dead duke's own seal. Gideon, the seal is the thing. The seal never left this house. It is in the muniment room on a chain, and somebody inside these walls pressed your father's own seal into 18,000 pounds of lies. And there are not so very many people in this house with the keys to that room, and your steward is one of them. And the steward carries his books in and out like a man who does not want them read. And I have spent my whole life being underestimated by exactly that kind of smooth, clean-handed man, and I should like, for once, to be underestimated to some purpose. If you have followed a poor girl up a Duke's Drive this far, come the rest of the way with her. Because what she does next, she does with 5 weeks and a candle and a dead schoolmaster's one strange gift, against a baronet, a beauty, and a county that has already made up its mind. And if you want to see a nobody take a great house's honor back out of the fire in front of 400 people, then stay and subscribe, and we will go on to the assembly together. She worked through December the way her father had worked through his boxes of parish papers, by lamplight, in order, missing nothing. She had Gideon bring her every letter in the muniment room in the late Duke's own hand, and there were hundreds of them. Letters to his agent and his banker and his son and his sister, spanning 30 years, and she laid them out on the long table by date, and she read the hand into herself until she could have written it. And she learned Edmund Amberley from his pen the way you learn a person you have loved, his impatience, his kindness, the way he pressed hardest on the downstroke of a capital, and let his final letters trail when he was tired. The particular way he made an ampersand, backward, in a single stroke, which is a thing no two people do alike and which a copyist almost never gets, because a copyist draws where the true hand runs. And she took the 3 bonds and she read the signatures on them against 30 years of true ones. Close under a glass Gideon had brought her from his father's own desk, and she found what she had known she would find. Because a forgery is not writing, it is drawing. And drawing has a different pace, and the different pace leaves marks. The tiny stops in the line where the copyist lifted his pen to look back at the model. The faint tremor of a hand going slow where the true hand went fast. The ampersand on all 3 bonds made forward, in 2 strokes, the way an ordinary person makes it, and not backward in one, the way Edmund Amberley had made his in every one of 300 letters across 30 years. She marked every one of these with a pencil dot on a sheet of tracing paper laid over a copy, and she built, over 3 weeks, a thing her father would have wept to see, a full anatomy of the lie, a page for each bond showing where the pen had stopped and started and where the drawing showed through the writing, and it was beautiful and exact, and it was still, she knew, not enough. Because it was hers, a nobody's word laid over a dead man's letters, and the county would not take a schoolmaster's daughter's anatomy of an ampersand against a baronet's sworn word. She needed the mouth. She found the mouth in the second week of January, and she found it as she had told Gideon she would, between the two houses, in a frightened man paid too little. His name was Corny, and he had been the late Duke's own confidential clerk for 11 years, the man who had kept the private ledgers and dusted the seal and copied the fair drafts, and he had been turned out of Harrowfield within a month of the old Duke's death, in the reshuffle that had brought Pruitt in, with a quarter's wages and no character, and he had gone down in the world since, and Ivy found him at last through Mrs. Bledlow, who knew where everyone in 3 parishes had gone, keeping the books of a small brewery in the market town 9 miles off and drinking more of its produce than was good for him. Ivy drove over in a plain gig, alone, on a market day, so that a gig would not be marked, and she sat with the man Corny in the back room of a low inn, and she did not accuse him of anything, because her father had taught her that a frightened man confesses nothing to a prosecutor, and everything to a listener. She told him she was cataloguing the late Duke's papers, and had found his fair copies among them, and had admired the hand, which was true, and she asked him about the old Duke, and the man, who had loved his master, and had been thrown out over his grave, and had told the whole grief to nobody in 2 years, because who listens to a discharged clerk, talked and drank and talked. And somewhere in the second hour, when she asked him quietly whether the late Duke had had many dealings with Sir Roland Cardew, the man Corny went the color of the ash in the grate and put his glass down and said in a low, fast voice that he had wondered, these 2 years, whether anyone would ever ask him that, and that he had prayed they would not, and known that he would not sleep sound again until they did. What Corny told her in the back room of the low inn, with his hands round a cold glass, was this. In the last winter of the old Duke's life, the winter of 1869, Pruitt had come to Harrowfield, brought in over Corny's head as steward, a smooth young man with a letter of recommendation from, of all houses, Cardew Court. And in the weeks after the old Duke died, before the new Duke had his feet under him, Pruitt had asked Corny, once, carefully, whether it might be possible, for the estate's convenience, to make up certain fair copies of bonds from the Duke's memoranda, and had spoken of a sum owing to Sir Roland, and Corny, who had kept that Duke's books for 11 years, and knew to the shilling what the Duke owed and to whom, had said there was no such sum and no such memoranda, and that he would make up no such thing, and had been discharged inside the month with a quarter's wages and no character, and had understood, watching from 9 miles off as the new bonds surfaced 2 years later, exactly what had been made and by whom. Once he was safely out of the house, and there was no honest clerk left in it to say the seal had been used on a day the Duke was in his grave. Ivy said, "Will you swear that?" And Corny, who was a weak man and knew it, and had drunk 2 years of his self-respect, looked at the schoolmaster's daughter across the sticky table and said the truest thing he had said in his life, which was that he did not know if he was brave enough, and that Cardew was a hard man and a rich one, and he, Corny, was a discharged clerk with a fondness for drink and no character, and who would take his word? And Ivy said, "I would not ask you to stand on your word. I would ask you to stand on the truth, and the truth does not need you to be brave. It needs you to be there, and to answer what you are asked, and let the paper do the rest, because I have the paper, Mr. Corny. I have paper that was made 3 years after it was signed. All you need do is tell the room, in your own voice, that you kept that Duke's books for 11 years, and that there was no such debt, and that you were asked to make a false copy and refused. And then you may sit down, and the paper and I will do the rest." She let him think for a day. She drove home, and she did not tell Gideon she had found the mouth. Not yet, because she was learning that hope, given too soon to a man who has had it broken, does more harm than good. She went instead to the last piece, which was the seal, and it was the seal that gave her Pruitt in the end. Because she asked Mr. Ashe, the butler, quietly, who held the keys to the muniment room, and Ashe said, "His Grace," and the dowager, who had a set from the old days, and the steward. And Ivy asked whether the steward's set had always included the muniment key. And Ashe, who missed nothing in that house, and had disliked Pruitt from the first, said that it had not, that the muniment key had been added to the steward's ring by Mr. Pruitt's own request in the spring of 1870, for the convenience, he had said, of consulting the old deeds. And Ivy said, "Thank you, Mr. Ashe," and went up to the muniment room and took the Harrowfield seal down off its chain and looked at it under the glass. The great silver matrix the size of a crown piece, with the horn and the shield of Harrowfield cut into it, and she took an impression of it in wax. And then she took the 3 bonds and she laid their wax seals beside her fresh impression under the glass. And she saw, because she was looking for it now, the small thing that a man in a hurry 2 years before had not thought anyone would ever look for. A nick in the rim of the true matrix, a tiny bruise in the silver where the seal had once been dropped, that printed as a little flaw in the wax of every true Harrowfield seal, and that was there, faithfully, in her fresh impression, and was there, faithfully, in the wax of all 3 bonds, which proved past any lawyer's argument that the bonds had been sealed not with some copy or forgery of the seal, but with the true matrix itself, the one that hung on a chain in a locked room to which, in the whole world, 4 people had a key. And one of those 4 had come to Harrowfield out of Cardew Court, and had asked, 6 months in, for the key to be added to his ring. She had it all by the middle of January. She had the paper that could not have existed in 1864. She had the hand, an anatomy of every place the forger's pen had stopped to look at its model. She had the seal, and the nick in the seal, and the man who had asked for the key, and she had the mouth, a frightened clerk who had kept the true books for 11 years and had been thrown out for refusing to cook them. She laid it all out one night on the long library table for Gideon and the dowager both, because she had asked the old woman to be carried down, and she took them through it piece by piece the way her father had taken her through a document when she was a girl, from the paper up, and when she had finished there was a silence in the library, and then the Dowager Duchess of Harrowfield, 79 years old, who had come to that house as a bride in 1812 and had forgiven the world nothing, put out one dry old hand and laid it flat on the anatomy of the forged ampersand and said, in a voice that had gone strange, "My son did not borrow money from Roland Cardew." And Ivy said, gently, "No, ma'am, he did not. He died owing that man nothing but the contempt of an honest gentleman for a grasping one, and somebody has spent 2 years trying to turn that into £25,000 and half your grandson's land, and we are going to stop them. But I must tell you both plainly how I mean to do it, because it is a hard way, and there is no soft one." And she told them, she said the bonds could be exposed quietly, by lawyers, in an office, over months, and that if they did it that way, Cardew would fight it every inch, and delay it, and blacken the discharged clerk, and question the paper, and it would drag through the courts for 3 years and cost a fortune, and leave a smell over the house forever. Half the county always half believing that the Harrowfields had wriggled off a true debt on a technical quibble about a watermark. Or, she said, they could do it the other way, the way Cardew himself had chosen, in the open, in front of the whole county, at the assembly where Cardew meant to spring his trap. They could let him spring it. They could let him stand up in the county rooms in front of 400 people and present his bonds and demand his money and enjoy his moment. And then nobody in a plain dress could stand up and take it all to pieces in front of the same 400. The paper and the hand and the seal and the clerk. So that there could never afterward be any quibble or any doubt or any half-belief, because the whole county would have watched the lie fall down with its own eyes. She said, "It is a great risk. If I have made one error, if there is one thing in this I have read wrong, we do it in front of everyone, and we are finished for good and all, and I will have destroyed you, where a quiet lawyer might have saved you slowly." She looked at Gideon. She said, "It is your house and your name, and it must be your choice. And I will do it whichever way you say and never reproach you." And Gideon Amberley, Duke of Harrowfield, who had stood in front of 400 people 3 years before and been broken in the open and had hidden from the open ever since, looked at his wife across the table full of papers for a long time, and then he said, in the plain, steady voice she had married him for, in the open, "Let him have his 400 people, and let them watch you." The winter assembly of that county was held in the county rooms in the market town on the last Thursday of January, and it was the one night of the year when everyone came, the great houses and the small, the squires and the parsons and the doctors and the attorneys and the half-pay officers and their wives and daughters. 400 people under 100 candles in a long room, with a musician's gallery at one end, and it had been for 3 years the chief theater of the Duke of Harrowfield's humiliation, the room where the county had first looked at him after the wedding that did not happen, and he had not entered it since. He entered it that night at 9 o'clock, with his grandmother on one arm, the Dowager Duchess in the black silk and the old lace, and the diamonds she had not worn in a decade, and his wife on the other, and Ivy Sutcliffe wore that night, for the first time, a gown that was not turned or patched or gray, a plain gown of deep blue that the Dowager herself had ordered for her and had supervised to the last stitch, with no lace and no jewels but her mother's ring made small with a twist of thread, because she had asked to keep the ring, and the Dowager had understood why. And the three of them came through the doors together, and down the length of that long bright room, and the county, which had come expecting to watch a schoolmaster's daughter be small, watched instead a duke walk back into the room that had broken him with his head up and a straight old woman on one arm and a straight young one on the other, and did not know, for a moment, what it was looking at. Sir Rowland Cardew knew. He had planned his evening, and it did not depend on the Duke's expression. He let the dancing begin, and he let an hour go by, and he had his daughter stand up for 2 dances looking lovelier than anyone and sadder than anyone, the young widow home from her tragedy, so that the county's sympathy should be all arranged in the right direction before he struck. And then, at the turn of the evening, in the lull when the musicians rested, and the long room was full of standing, talking people, and nobody was dancing, Sir Rowland Cardew moved to the middle of the floor, near the great fireplace, where the light was best and the room could see, and he raised his voice in the jovial, carrying way of a man doing a painful public duty, and he said that he was sorry, more sorry than he could say, to bring a matter of business into a night of pleasure, but that there were things a gentleman could not in honor let lie, and that it touched a great house present that night, and that he thought it better said in the open, among friends, then whispered, and the room, smelling it, went quiet and gathered, and Ivy, standing near the dowager at the side of the room, felt Gideon go still beside her, and put 2 fingers on his sleeve, once, and took them away. Sir Roland Cardo told the county, in his carrying voice, that the late Duke of Harrowfield, a man he had honored, had in his lifetime borrowed of him, Cardo, in his hour of need, the sum of £18,000, upon 3 bonds under the Duke's own hand and seal for the improvement of his estate, and that the debt with its interest now stood at above £25,000, and had fallen due, and that he had come privately to the present Duke and been met, he was grieved to say, with denial and delay, and that he was reduced at last to this, to asking the present Duke, here, among the county that knew them both, whether he meant to honor his father's hand and seal, or whether the word of a Harrowfield was now a thing that must be enforced at law. And he drew from his breast the 3 bonds, and held them up, and the candlelight shone through them. And 400 people looked at the Duke of Harrowfield, and waited for him to be finished. And the Duke of Harrowfield said, into the silence, in a clear, even voice that carried to the gallery, my wife will answer you. There was a sound in the room, a single low sound, the sound of 400 people turning their heads. And Ivy Sutcliffe, the schoolmaster's daughter, in the plain blue gown, walked out into the middle of the floor by the great fireplace where the light was best, and stood in front of Sir Roland Cardew and his 3 papers, with her hands quiet at her sides. And she was not grand and she was not loud, and when she spoke the room had to hush itself further to hear her, which is a thing that commands a room far more surely than shouting, as her father had known, teaching 30 boys in a stone room with nothing but the pitch of his voice. She said, Sir Roland, will you let me hold one of the bonds up to the light? He should not have given it to her. He knew, some later said, in the half-second before he did it, that he should not, but 400 people were watching a baronet refuse a small polite request from a lady, and there was nothing he could do but hand it to her with a smile. And Ivy took the bond and carried it to the branch of candles on the mantel-shelf and held it up so that the flame was behind it, and she said, in her clear carrying voice, I will ask everyone who can to come and look, because I do not want one soul in this room to take my word for anything tonight. I want you to see it with your own eyes. There is a mark in this paper. All good paper has one. The makers press it in with wire. It is called a watermark, and you cannot see it until you put a flame behind it, and then it rises up out of the paper like a thing coming up through water. There is a shield in this corner with a horn in it, the mark of the mill, and beneath the shield there is a date, because the honest mills of England date their molds and change the wire every year, and are proud to do it. And the date in this paper, ladies and gentlemen, woven into the very stuff of it, under the words that say this bond was signed in the year 1864, is the year 1867. She let that sit. She said this bond could not have been signed in 1864, because the paper it is written on did not exist until 3 years later. And the late Duke of Harrowfield, who is charged tonight with having signed it, was in his own chapel vault a year before ever this sheet came off the mold. She held it higher. She said, come and look, and they came. That was the thing that broke Roland Cardew. Not a lawyer's affidavit, but 400 of his own neighbors getting up out of their chairs and crossing the floor and holding his bonds to his own candles and seeing the little wire figures rise up out of the paper. 1867, 1867, on all 3, one after another, passed hand to hand down the length of the county rooms, and the sound that went through the crowd, low and growing, the sound of a great many people understanding the same thing at the same time. Sir Rowland's voice came up over it, loud now, the joviality gone, saying it was a Mills error, a fault in the wire, that it proved nothing, that a clerk had plainly copied an older bond onto a fresh sheet for safekeeping, and Ivy let him say all of it. And then she said, into the pause he had to leave for breath, "Then let us look at the writing, Sir Rowland, since you speak of a clerk who copied." And she laid on the mantel shelf, in the good light, 2 things she had brought folded in her glove: a true letter of the late Duke's, and her tracing her anatomy, and she said, "I have here a letter the late Duke wrote to his banker in 1863, in his own hand past any question, and I have here the signatures on these bonds, and I will show you one thing only, because it is a thing anyone can see once it is shown." The late Duke of Harrowfield made his ampersand, his and sign, backward, in a single stroke. All his life it is in every letter he ever wrote. Here it is, and here and here. And the man who signed these bonds made his ampersand forward, in 2 strokes the ordinary way, the way you and I make it, because a man may copy the shape of another man's letters, but he cannot copy the road the other man's hand travels, and a forger draws where the true hand runs, and draws, always, in his own habits underneath the borrowed ones. Look at the true one. Now look at the bond. It is not the same hand. It is a good copy, made by somebody who had the late Duke's letters in front of him and studied them. But it is a copy, and it is a copy made on paper from 1867, and I will now tell you who made it, and I will not ask you to take my word for that either. She turned toward the side of the room, and she said, "Mr. Corney, will you come out?" And the discharged clerk, who had been standing at the back all evening in a coat Ivy had quietly made for him so that he should not stand in that room in his poverty, came out into the light, frightened and pale and upright, and he told the county, in a voice that shook at first and then steadied, because the truth is a thing you can lean on, that he had kept the late Duke's private books for 11 years and knew every debt that Duke had owed to any man living, and that there had never been any debt to Sir Rowland Cardew, not of £18,000 nor of 18 shillings, and that within a month of the old Duke's death the new steward, lately come to Harrowfield out of Sir Rowland Cardew's own household, had asked him, Corney, to make up fair copies of certain bonds from memoranda that did not exist, and that he had refused, and had been turned out that same month with a quarter's wages and no character, and had held his tongue 2 years out of fear, and was ashamed of the fear, and was done with it. And Ivy said, quietly, "The steward's name is Pruitt, and he holds the only 4th key to the room where the Harrowfield seal is kept, a key that was added to his ring at his own request in the spring of 1870. And the seals on these bonds were pressed with the true Harrowfield matrix itself, which never left that locked room. You may see it by the flaw it carries, a nick in the rim that prints in every true seal and prints in these. So the paper is of 1867, and the hand is a copyist's, and the seal is the true one, used by a man who had a key he asked for 6 months after the Duke, who might have questioned it was dead." She turned last of all and looked at Sir Rowland Cardew across the space the crowd had left, and she said, in the plain voice she had used to the man at the door of a cottage in Aldworth in the rain, "You did not reckon, Sir Rowland, on a schoolmaster's daughter, because there was no reason you should. My father taught a parish its letters for 19 years, and left me nothing in the world but £4 in a tin, and the trick of reading a hand and holding a paper to the light. And I have spent my life being counted for nothing by men with clean hands and smooth voices, and I have learned to be glad of it, because it means they never trouble to hide the paper from me until it is too late. It was over very quickly after that. The way such things are, the county turned. All at once, the whole 400, and it did not turn gently. Because a crowd that has been made a fool of hates the man who fooled it. And Roland Cardew, who had come to that room to break the Duke of Harrowfield in the open, went out of it broken in the open himself, with his daughter white and silent behind him, past neighbors who 3 hours before had bowed to him and now looked through him as though he were a draught. The steward Pruitt was gone from Harrowfield before the family reached home, over the hills in the night on a hired horse, and was heard of long after in the Americas. And the bonds went to the county's own magistrates the next morning, and there was talk for a while of a prosecution, and in the end there was none, because Roland Cardew was old and finished, and the county's contempt was a heavier sentence than any court's, and Gideon, when it came to it, found he had no appetite to pursue a ruined man, having been won. Lucinda Cardew left the county within the month, and married, 2 years later, a wine merchant in Bristol, and was, by all accounts, tolerably content, which is the ordinary end of people the stories make into monsters. She had wanted a great house and a great name, and had reached for them twice with a beautiful cold hand, and had closed it, both times, on air. But that was all afterward. On the night itself there was the drive home in the dark, the three of them in the carriage, the dowager bolt upright and silent for the first 2 miles, and then saying, to the window, not to either of them, "My son sat in a room with that man 100 times and never knew, and this girl unmade him in a quarter of an hour with a candle," and then, turning her half-blind eyes on Ivy in the dark, "You will come to me tomorrow, and you will teach me to see that mark in the paper, because I am 79 years old, and I do not intend to be deceived again in the years I have left. And I have not had anything new worth learning put before me in a very long time." And that, from the Dowager Duchess of Harrowfield, was love, and Ivy knew it, and said, "Yes, ma'am," and reached across the dark carriage and took the old dry hand, and the old woman let her. And there was, at the last, Gideon. He did not speak in the carriage. He waited until they were home, until the dowager had been carried up and the house had gone quiet, and then he came to the library where Ivy was standing by the fire, still in the blue gown, too full of the night to sleep, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the doorway of the book-room the first night when he told her the truth standing up, and he said, "I married you under a false name to be sure of being wanted for the wrong reasons, and you have just stood up in front of the whole county and given me back my father's honor and my house and my name, and asked me for nothing, and I find," he said, and his even voice was not quite even now, "I find I no longer have the smallest idea how to be a man who does not want you, and I do not know how to say the rest of it, because I have not said such a thing to anyone in my life, and the once I meant to I was left at an altar for it, so I am going to say it badly." And Ivy Sutcliffe, who had been turned out of one house for the want of £40 a year, and had walked up the drive of another married to a stranger to keep out of the workhouse, looked at the Duke of Harrowfield across the warm room and said, "Say it badly then, because I was not raised to trust a thing said well, and my father told me the only words worth having are the ones a person can hardly get out." And he crossed the room and told her, badly, and it was the truest thing she ever heard, and she kept it all her life. They were not married again, being married already, but they were, that spring, blessed in Harrowfield Church by the old rector before the whole parish, in the light, with the doors open, and the county came, all 400 of them, because the county always comes. And Ivy walked up the aisle of the church where Gideon had once stood alone for 50 minutes, and she walked up it on his arm, And the dowager sat in the great pew in her diamonds, and did not pretend she could see well enough to read the service, and did not care who knew it. And Ivy had her Uncle Barrow sent an invitation, in her own clear copperplate hand, because she was not a woman who kept accounts of that kind, and he came, and stood at the back, and folded his hat very small in his hands, and did not for once in his life know what to say, and she was kind to him, because she could afford to be, which is the only time kindness to such people is any use. So let me leave you where I found her, and ask you the thing I have been turning over since I first held one of those bonds to a candle. This house was very nearly lost, not to a great crime, but to a small, clever forgery that fooled 2 trained lawyers, and it was saved by a poor girl with no rank and no money, and one strange, useless gift her father had given her on winter evenings, for no reason but that he had nobody else to give it to. Nobody in that county thought a schoolmaster's daughter worth teaching to read a hand. Her own aunt said it would never boil a pot. And it took back a dukedom's honor out of the fire in front of 400 people. So tell me, before you go, what is the useless thing somebody taught you once, for love and for no profit, that turned out to be the most valuable thing you owned? And tell me, too, where you are watching from, and what the weather is doing there tonight, because I ask everyone, and I read everyone. Next time I will tell you what became of the discharged clerk who found his courage, and of the blue gown, and of the first child born at Harrowfield in a generation, and why the whole county came up that long mile of limes a second time with the bells going. And now, one last picture before you go. A great honey-colored house at the end of a mile of bare limes, and a light in the library window late, and inside it an old blind woman and a young clear-eyed one bent together over a single candle, holding an ordinary sheet of paper up to the flame, watching a hidden thing rise slowly up out of it into the light, where anyone who troubles to look may see it at last.